Good practice doesn't emerge out of nowhere. It may be triggered by our personal values and adherence to a set of carefully crafted principles, but it still requires tools to guide us and provide a degree of consistency in implementation. We also don't always operate in splendid isolation. We more often than not function within teams or groups of people. So these are the two areas that I'm going to address in this presentation. Now, I mentioned tools in the previous presentation. Well, it's about accessing the appropriate tools, not just any tools. And from the early days of my awareness, going back to the early 90s through connection with Professor Charlie Rapp, well, they'd already, in the University of Kansas, they'd already developed a strengths assessment. I've adapted that slightly and developed it a bit more in a UK context over the intervening years. So at one level, we're talking about our clients and the importance of client strengths-based practice. I'm talking about the development of a strengths assessment tool that helps us to pick up on this positive picture for that individual person. But it's exactly the same approach that can then be adapted and applied to individual staff members, focusing on their strengths, which challenges you to think about how do you build up that picture and help them to work with their own strengths within the context of their job role. I've also developed a version of the same approach in terms of tools that help teams, help them to reflect on their achievement as teams, their resources as teams, their priorities for the future as teams. So again, there'll be consistent themes that underpin the development of each of these tools so that they do follow a very similar approach. Being equitable at all levels of working, we should also be reflecting on the strengths of the systems that we are developing and putting into practice, and the strengths of the organisation itself. What is working well? What levels of communication work well? What types of management work well? The connections between different parts of the organisation that work well. Well, perhaps it's human nature, but it's very easy to focus in on the things that go wrong. In doing so, we always have to remember, in the wider context of risk, that these are rare events. The vast majority of things go right, whether that's by accident or design. And it's incumbent on us to spend more time reflecting on why things go right and actually seeing the strengths in what it is that we're doing. Staying with some of these tools, the strengths assessment itself is a way of building up this positive picture over time. It's a process, not an event. It's not a one-off in order to just get it done quickly. It builds up over time, gathers together different sources and types of information. But it's also a brief tool, so it's only about capturing specific words or very brief phrases. And it's okay to have gaps in the information. If you've got a form version of this, it's not about, so you've got a gap. What are you doing about it? Well, as I mentioned, it's a process. You will fill in gaps as and when relevant information emerges. Visibly, it's important that the tool you'd be using should act as a good prompt to your practice, help you to inquire into areas that maybe we're not so aware of in terms of where strengths exist, either historically, currently, or in terms of future wishes. And you can then use an update sheet between different reviews if you're capturing bits and pieces of information as time is passing by. It's a flexible process. You can come back and reflect, review at periods of time whenever you've determined that it's appropriate to review the whole picture. But in between time, we can just be capturing particular observations, additional strengths as they emerge, and record them on the structure of the strengths assessment itself. Again, there's no one way of doing this. The important thing is it's there to prompt, guide, and capture. If we look at how it's laid out, and the strengths assessment tool is in the resources in this module, there's a right-hand column that will focus on the future priorities. There may well be loads and loads of things that a person wants to achieve, but we can only work on a few at any one time. Sometimes only one or two at any one time. But it's still important to be aware of all of the future wishes that they hold in different aspects of their life. So if they do want to accumulate lots of wishes for change and what their future might look like, let's record that picture. But then help the person to prioritize which areas they're going to work on first. That way it becomes this idea of a dynamic working document. And as the assessments build up, it will also dynamically link in with emergent plans. So check out that strengths assessment tool and the supporting guidance that goes with it. They are additional resources within this module. Yes, we also have something I call strengths-based support plans. Another one of the tools that you'll see in the resources in this module, complete with guidance notes. The important message here is that each individual plan should link to a priority established at the end of the strengths assessment. So again, bits of paper or electronic versions that link together so that they become working dynamic documents. It provides prompts to develop the details of that plan. It enables you to document progress against the stages of that plan. But I'm not inviting you through these kinds of tools to spend all of your time writing and just be focused on a screen or on a piece of paper. So the significant bits of progress towards achieving whatever the overall plan is, that's what's important. The significant bits. Lots of other stuff can be captured in other places depending on what system you work with and depending on what business you're working in, what the organization requires. I'm sorry, as much as I'd like to, I can't magic away a lot of that other stuff. So you might have other ways of capturing daily notes, daily reflections, contacts. That doesn't all go onto the strengths documents. No, these strengths-based plans or the strengths assessment, these capture very specific pieces of information. There will be other space elsewhere where you can capture, if you need to capture, all of those other nitty-gritty details that your organization, your area of work requires. Ultimately, what you do document on these formats is your judgment call. But as I said before, there's guidance notes that will help. The tools in this particular module, coming back to the idea of not just applying this to clients, to service users, but to also apply it to staff as well. For example, thinking about how we focus in on working with people around appraisal or through supervision. How do we ensure that the systems that I mentioned earlier in the organization will reflect on the strengths and that we will reflect on the strengths of the systems? Well, it's a strengths-oriented system if it really does help us with our employees or our supervisees to focus in on what they're interested in, personally and professionally. How do we help them to identify those desires, those wishes, those important things to them in terms of the nature of the work that they do? How can we support staff to learn from each other? We have these cliched phrases such as learning the lessons, developing a culture of learning. Well, a strengths approach is genuinely interested in that kind of detail on the ground. What's happening for people? How do we do that? That's what a strengths approach is really trying to focus in on. And by really focusing on the practical level, and some of these tools are really designed to do that, to support us, that will help us to then learn from each other, focus on each other, particularly through seeing the complementary strengths across a wider group of people, across the team. What are the strengths of individual people when they're dealing with clients or when they're in communication with other staff? How can I make use of those if I'm observing strengths in others? And whether it's appropriate, there's a first decision is it appropriate for me to adopt other people's strengths? Have I got the skill and the capability, personal qualities to take on some of these strengths of others? So it is about being aware of the strengths in others around us and seeing how we can learn from them. Ultimately, it's about giving people time to talk, to reflect together, as well as reflecting separately. And it's a very significant degree of importance I'm putting on reflection. Something that's got lost in so many of the pressures imposed in a more bureaucratic world. But I feel from experience that it is so vitally important to retain and prioritize reflection time. It becomes very short-sighted to aim at just hitting targets for administration, and in so doing not allowing people time to really focus and think and reflect. It's a cliche in itself, but it's true that if we spend that time in the short term, we will save so much more time in the longer term. Staying with the idea of teams. This is a way that I've captured developing strengths within a group, particularly a group of assertive outreach teams in the UK. That's a very specific type of mental health service. And this is based on work that I was doing between 2001 and 2011, by and large. There was a range of different teams. I actually published an article back in 2008 which captures 7 of these projects, but there were also 3 others in different cities, in rural areas around the UK, or actually more specifically around England. But I also looked at a whole range of other teams where I've been involved, perhaps not at the same in-depth amount of development as these, but certainly focused with them around training to do with strengths. And as I did this, and bear in mind, this isn't published research. I'm not a researcher. This is practice-based evidence. This is more my way of describing different teams, about the different levels of strengths working or acknowledging or awareness within those teams. What I see is that the majority of teams are what I call strengths acknowledging teams. What this means is that when I raise a specific focus around strengths, they will acknowledge that that's an important thing to do. But there will be very little evidence that it is actually happening in practice. So if in a discussion I may say, I think working with people's strengths is very important because they're all parts of the resources that we tap into. And let's say this is the very first time that somebody has heard that message, then the likelihood is they'll say, yeah, of course it is. Yeah, I think that's very important. But then if we question them a little bit further, we'll find that they might acknowledge the point, but they're not doing anything in practice to deliver on that point. If we go to the next level, they are strengths-aware teams, and this is where training has taken place. From my observations, training has been a resource that is useful for raising awareness more than anything else. So in this instance, they become strengths-aware teams. This means that they go beyond just a brief acknowledgement. There's an understanding that because the training has helped to identify the what, the where, the why, the background, the evidence, there's now a very significant level of thinking that in these kinds of teams, we should be doing this. We should be putting this into practice. And there might even be an attempt by some members of the team in following a training event, but it doesn't necessarily translate into practice that well or in any significant depth, because sadly it gets consumed by all the other day-to-day demands that are put on the team. So for true strengths work in teams, it has to go beyond training. There needs to be attention to detail, and that can only happen in the workplace, not in the workshop. And that's why my approach from 2001 for many years was around practice development. That's why I adopted the practice-based evidence name from the outset. It's how do we get in alongside and support people to make the change? And then when they make the change, using the tools, using the structures, using the strengths of these systems in the organization, how do you get people to remain focused on strengths? Working with strengths as their default position, not allowing it to slip away when other demands and other crises take over. This slide provides my description of how I've observed strengths ways of thinking and working to happen within teams. The vast majority are strengths acknowledging. There are trained teams that become strengths aware, and there are very few teams, because it does take far more attention, that I would say are strengths working teams. Let's go back to another strengths quote just for a moment. Matti Stepanek, a US poet. Matti says that unity is strength. When there is teamwork and collaboration, wonderful things can be achieved. That's a very good reason why we need to focus on the teams, the teamwork, bringing people together, seeing strengths in a wider picture, not just something one individual worker does with one individual person. And here's an image that reflects that really well. Teamwork in action. There you go. I like that image. That really is one of teamwork. Strength in collaboration gives a much stronger, more confident picture. As I draw this presentation to a close, I want you to spend time looking at the tools and the guidance provided in this module. The strengths assessment, the strengths-based support plans, the staff strengths assessment, the team strengths assessment. How will you incorporate these into your work in practice? Also, discuss as teams how you intend using these tools to help achieve strengths as a default way of working.